All right, it's time again. What's up, everybody? Ben Razamakijeski here for OddsShopper and for Betting You, college sports betting podcast, and of course, breakdown of all things college football. The season is rapidly approaching. It is August. That means games will be played in this very month. So we have got to break down these conferences, find these win totals, because the window to place these bets is closing today. ACC. I think this was my favorite conference to break down last year, Matt. I know you told me before the show you've got some teams that you're very interested in. I love a conference like this because to me it's very bunched up outside of Clemson.
Yeah, and I think that's reflected in the odds. We just did the Big Ten show where you have a huge favorite in Ohio State, and we kind of have that in Clemson. They're minus 120, but I think there's a lot more players with Clemson themselves. There's a little bit of question marks with the team, and there are teams in this conference I think you could see overtaking them in certain scenarios. So it is one I like to bet quite a bit.
It's going to be very, very interesting to see who you're high on, see who I'm high on. Who even knows what I'm thinking here. If you are hopping in for the first time, checking out the channel, checking out the show, welcome to Betting You. Welcome to OddsShopper. Hit the like button if you want to support us. Certainly subscribe because we are going to have a ton of college football content. Do I even need to say NFL? I think you guys know we'll have you covered and everything else in between. But let's get started. Let's get to it. And of course, even though it was a really disappointing year last year, I think everyone still acknowledges that the ACC starts and kind of, I'm not going to say ends, but it certainly goes through Clemson. They're the overwhelming favorite. The win total for them is 10.5. The over is slightly the dog, but it's still just plus 110. They are better than even money to win the ACC at minus 120. Are these type of prices warranted? And then talk to me about what I want to know in the QB situation for the Tigers.
I think they're warranted just looking at the history of Clemson. You can go back and look at them over the last few years. They're the overwhelming power in the ACC. They just lost Trevor Lawrence, so that's a big loss for them, and they took a step back. DJ Uiagalelei was not the quarterback that everyone thought he was, at least to this point. There have been some news coming out about him. Was he dealing with weight issues? He seems to try to frame it that way. And Dabo Swinney's been very vocal this offseason that he is the guy, at least to start. Every time, once they get on the field, that will be decided. And if he needs to make a change, he certainly will because Cade Klubnik is behind him. But it appears that Uiagalelei is going to start the year, which hopefully he can improve. If he cannot, then I think looking at the under on this win total could be in play. The other thing you have to worry about with Clemson, if you're a win total backer, outside of this is just the replacements that they have to make on defense. This is a team that does not attack the transfer portal. They've kind of taken this moral high ground, whether you think that's right or not. It could affect them in future seasons. They've, not approached NIL the same way that some other teams have, and that's kind of just Dabo Swinney's opinion on the matter. But from there, if Clemson does take a step back offensively at the quarterback position, something they showed a willingness to do at the end of last year was just ride the run. And I think that's something they could do again this year. When you look at their team, I think they are kind of composed in a way where they can do that. Will Shipley's back. They have Kobe Pace, Phil Maffa, a lot of players that they can use at the running back position. And then their offensive line should be a little bit better here, in my opinion. Excuse me. My voice is just gone.
Same as last week. Going on, man? You all right?
No, I've been sick. Anyway, so their offensive line. Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
All right. Their offensive line should be pretty good is the whole point.
I agree. I'm not going to push back on anything. I do. Let me ask you again. I know you just went through this. How serious do you think the threat is from this true freshman QB? In the sense, do you think Clemson, is there any way, I want to ask you it this way. Is there any way that Clemson goes over their win total, barring injury, of course, and they yank Uiagalelei? Do you think this kid can overtake him unless, even without losses, or do you think it has to be like Clemson's season is over, they're 2-2, and now they turn over the keys to the freshman?
They're probably going to need losses based on the rhetoric coming out of Clemson right now with how much Dabo has been backing Uiagalelei. So, in that instance, if we see a lot of Klubnik, it probably is with losses. And I mean, they're not going to happen early in the year. So it's their first real test is going to come against Wake Forest in week 3. And they're probably going to be somewhere in the range of 14 to 17-point favorites. Their first game is against Georgia Tech. They're going to absolutely destroy them. Furman, Louisiana Tech. And then they get Wake Forest in week 3. And, outside of that, NC State's going to be a tougher test, but they play that game at home, which is solid. You don't really see too many tests outside of that. Notre Dame is a late season game. Miami's a late season game for them. The schedule's not unbeatable, but it's a little tougher than Clemson has played in recent years with their crossover having Miami, their non-con having Notre Dame, and a South Carolina team, which should gel by the end of the season. That's their final game. So to me, it's like you're going to play these easy 3 games with Uiagalelei. That should help his leash. I don't know what the quarterback situation looks like at the end of the year.
It's a weird, so to get to the bet itself at 10.5, I would lean over, but I'm not looking to really bet it. It's a situation, I think that Clemson will be favored in every game. Obviously, as the season goes on, we'll see what happens. But when I look at their schedule, even I guess Notre Dame on the road, they could be a slight dog. But if not, they're going to be favored in every single game.
I agree with you. So to me, it's a no bet on the win total, and probably a no bet when you look at them to win the conference. -120 is a lot. To win the Atlantic's -240. It's going to come down to the NC State game, and NC State's a very good team this year. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But overall, I think Clemson has all the makings of being a powerhouse again, but really it all comes down to the quarterback position. The rest of their roster is pretty good. I like their offensive line. I like their running back. Their defense is really solid up front. They're replacing a lot in the secondary, and they didn't really add any transfers. So they're going to be relying a lot on high-profile recruits. They certainly have those. If you're looking at offensive questions, I think it's at the wide receiver position. They still haven't been able to find replacements for Justin Ross and T. Higgins. Nada has been an underachiever. Bo Collins, underachiever. EJ Williams especially. They do have some young kids, but this has been a big problem for them. I would love to see a freshman come in and play well for Clemson. It's not all on Uiagalelei. Their weapons in the pass game are terrible, so I think their best path is running it.
Yeah, and again, it remains to be seen. To me, it's a pass. I have no interest in betting them to win the ACC. I think there's several teams that can give them serious challenges. The most obvious would be the Miami Hurricanes, who are next up. They're on the other side, but a win total of 8.5, slightly juiced to the over at -125, plus 550 to win the ACC, plus 150 to win the Coastal, which is the non-Clemson side. I talked about Van Dyke in our Heisman Trophy video. Not that I think he's going to win the award, but I think he's going to have a big-time year. And as he goes, I think this team goes. They do get Texas A&M in non-con, and they do have to go to Clemson. Those are going to be tough games, but the rest of the schedule really sets up well. And we've got wiggle room. We're looking for 9 wins, and I think we get there.
I like this Miami team a lot. Cristobal coming over has done wonders for the program, and they probably won't even manifest a lot of their talent till future seasons because a lot of it's coming via recruiting. But the quarterback position, I still think it's a question mark. A lot of people in college football seem to be on differing opinions with Tyler Van Dyke. Some people believe, he's going to be a first-round pick, and others believe he's a replacement caliber quarterback. And I think you can make arguments on either side. He completed 62% of his passes for 9 yards per attempt. That's solid, but he did so in a really small sample. And you have to remember, this guy was the third-string quarterback on the team. Like, why was Garcia ahead of him if he's so good? And he did everything in a very small ACC sample, so he's not mobile. There are certainly questions with him. I like Josh Gaddis coming over as OC. He kind of had this dynamic rushing attack with Michigan, and a lot of the rhetoric coming out of them this summer at media days talked about how they're going to run the ball more. So they have Jalen Knighton. He's solid. Donald Chaney's still there. They added Ole Miss transfer Henry Parrish. I like that. They return a lot of starters on the offensive line. They lost their best offensive lineman in Jared Williams, but they have a lot of high-profile players returning. Zion Nelson and DJ Scaife were both awesome starters, and they both should be playing tackle this year. A couple of recruits coming in that are solid too, and they returned 7 starters on defense. So the roster is pretty strong overall, and we didn't even talk about receiver. Frank Ladson comes over from Clemson, another loss for them. Xavier Restrepo's back. He's a solid receiver. It's a solid roster overall, and I like that they play in the easier side of the conference. You mentioned the non-con. They're going to be a dog against Texas A&M. There's no way around it. But outside of that, their schedule isn't terrible. Clemson in the crossover, not great, but their side of the conference is definitely winnable. So when you're talking about a win total that's sitting at 8.5, I think they're going to be favored in 9 to 10 games this year. And if they can put it all together with some of these incoming talent and Van Dyke can play to the level we saw last year, they should eclipse this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you A&M and Clemson as losses. You got to find 2 more losses to not cash this win total. I don't see it. You got possibilities. Florida State, Miami's at home there. At Virginia, home to Pittsburgh. I guess those are the toughest games. Virginia Tech is awful. Duke is awful. Georgia Tech is bad. I don't see it. They're going to be 3-1 in non-con. I don't see any way. Obviously, Bethune-Cookman's not beating them. Southern Miss, MTSU. I think there's a lot of easy wins on this Miami schedule.
Yeah, people might call it difficult because you see Texas A&M in the non-con, but it's built like a barbell. You have really tough games where they probably lose against A&M and Clemson. And the spread with Clemson might be within a touchdown based on the way the odds look right now. And a lot of that rides on Clemson's quarterback situation. If they figure it out, they're probably double-digit favorites. If not, they're probably single-digit. But the rest of their games, they should be favored and pretty decently in 2. Like you mentioned, Florida State as a tough test, and Florida State could be. They have a lot to put together, but they have a solid roster overall. They're plus 3,500 to win the ACC. Miami's plus 550. If we were to start the season today and they played opening day, Miami's probably a 10-point favorite in that game.
That's what I'm saying. And that might be one of their toughest non-Clemson A&M type games. I think Miami gets to 9 or 10 wins. I think Miami has a real shot to beat Clemson in the ACC championship game because I believe they're going to be there. Don't even mind betting them to win the Coastal at plus 150 because I think, and this is the team I want to talk about the most, that Pittsburgh is one of the most interesting breakdowns here. Obviously, Kenny Pickett moves on. They still have 8.5 wins, similar to Miami, minus 110 on both sides, plus 800 to win the conference. So a little step back there. But what do you make of Pittsburgh? A lot of changes. Addison, Pickett, big-time names. What remains for them?
Yeah, their team kind of approaching the offseason slightly different than Miami. And I don't even know that this is true, but their head coach, he's just been very vocal about the portal and NIL. And I think that's probably because he's salty about losing Addison. And, Miami, they attacked the portal really hard. We didn't even really mention Miami's portal additions, but you can look and see they just ravaged the portal on offense, defense, everywhere, and they'll have multiple stars coming from there. Pitt's kind of done it out of necessity. They add Slovis at quarterback. He'll be the hopeful replacement for Kenny Pickett. They don't really have anyone behind him who possibly can do this, but Slovis was still the 4th highest graded quarterback in the Pac-12 last year, despite what's perceived to be a disappointing season, 65% completion rate, 7.2 yards per attempt. He does get a lot of turnovers, 8 interceptions just to 11 touchdowns, so that's an issue. But they also add receivers in the transfer portal. And no, they're not going to be able to replace Addison, but at least you have bodies that are productive. Like Kanata Mumfield was a fantastic freshman with Akron last year. Now we'll have to make the jump to the Power 5, and we'll see how he does. But they still have Jared Wayne coming back. He was a solid receiver in a rotational role. They have Gavin Bartholomew, who is an excellent young tight end for the team. The one thing I think that's going to change, and this has kind of been reflected in everything that's come out of Pitt this offseason, it seems that their head coach wasn't very happy with Whipple as their OC and the amount of times they threw the ball, which is funny to say because of how successful their offense was. But everything coming out of Pitt this offseason is like, we're going to run the ball more. We're going to run the ball more. And I think that is what their offense should do. They're returning their top 7 offensive linemen. Many of them are very good players. They return Israel Abanaconda at running back, Vincent Davis, and Rodney Hammond. I think Abanaconda is kind of poised for a larger workload. He had 3.6 yards after contact, forced a missed tackle, and nearly 33% of his rushes. Those are well above average. And I think they're just going to try to bully teams. To me, it comes down to, can they actually play in shootout scenarios if, they get down in a game early on? Can Slovis get them back in the game? And that remains to be seen. Also, defense going to be pretty strong here. They return a lot of players overall, 7 starters, and they already finished 46th overall. It's kind of littered with all conference players too. I won't mention them by name, but this is a very solid defense. So Pitt, unlike last year, I think is going to ride the run and ride their defense to a lot of wins this year. Even at 8.5, I still think this is pretty solid.
It's an interesting schedule for them. That's what they just have a lot of, I think, going to be toss-up type game. Even their non-con. You got West Virginia, Tennessee, Western Michigan, Rhode Island's a gimme. But like Tennessee and Pitt, what a game. Those are 2 teams, I think, on the upswing in some regard, particularly in Tennessee. Those are the type of games I think you're going to need to win to cash this, to get to 9 wins. Certainly the game against Miami, that's the last game of their season. I wouldn't be stunned if that's for the Coastal. Big time games. I think a little less high on Pittsburgh, but there's no doubting, you mentioned, if Slovis comes in and gives them some of what he gave USC at times, there's no doubt that they can keep it going after a really successful 2021.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say I'm high on this team. Like, I don't think they're going to win the conference or even their side, but it's just like, where do their losses come from?
That's
you
fair.
Mentioned non-con, but that's easily the most difficult part of their schedule. They're 6.5-point favorites over West Virginia. I think there's some value on the Mountaineer side, but still, that they're nearly a touchdown favorite in that game. There'll be a dog to Tennessee. I think it'll be close. And then there'll be a dog to Miami. They're favored in every other game they play this year. They're favored in 10 games.
That is, I'm just very interested to see how many of those spreads are 4.5, 6.5. I don't see them being massive favorites. Like, what did they open at? Not to derail the show, but I can look this up. What's their spread against West Virginia? Do you know it?
6.5.
Yeah. See, like there's going to be a lot of those. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. There's going to be a lot of games where Pitt is inside a touchdown favorite,
right.
I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, but like, think about the bottom end talent. If they're 6.5-point favorites against West Virginia, they're going to be like 14.5 against Western Michigan, who lost a lot. We'll talk about them in a future episode. Rhode Island, not even a question. Yeah. Then they play the 3 bottom teams in the conference. You play Georgia Tech, Syracuse, and Duke.
And Virginia Tech, who's going to be bad.
And Virginia, who's going through a coaching change, and they lost a ton of talent as well.
Yeah, you make a good case. It's just very interesting to think that Miami and Pittsburgh can coexist there in the same side, but it looks like they can, because I think there's a big discrepancy kind of as we work down, and we're going to talk about these teams here. I will say, if you're saying, man, I want some of this money to bet some of these win totals, BetMGM has you guys covered. Use the link in the description, or we got our own promo code, Betting U CFB. Betting, the letter U, CFB, all one word. Use either of those. Risk-free bet of up to $1,000. You sign up, deposit. It could be upwards of $1,000, and you're going to get that as a risk-free bet. You get a chance to take a shot. If you cash that ticket, boom. If you lose, you get the money back in free bets. Why not take advantage of that? BetMGM has done a lot. A lot of people have taken advantage of this already, and is a great bankroll boost before college football, before the NFL, during baseball. I got my baseball video out each and every day if you want to tail that pick. Let's keep it going. NC State, another 8.5 win total. Over is juiced to -150. This team is plus 800 to win the ACC. They are the big challenger to Clemson in the Atlantic. 5-1 just to win their side of it. I know that you're high on this team. I am as well. Let's talk about them and then talk about how serious of a threat are they to Clemson.
They're a serious threat. Clemson needs to figure out their quarterback position. Otherwise, they're going to be in a dogfight against NC State. This team is returning a ton of production, and for a team like NC State that doesn't recruit at the highest level, this is what needs to happen for them to take down a conference. They need to return a lot of starters at key positions with talent, and they certainly do that. They're returning 10 starters on defense, and that defense already finished 23rd in the country last year. That's a great place to start. Teams aren't going to be able to score on them, and if you're running out like a lame duck Uagalele, you're going to run into problems. Because this NC State offense can score, they're going to be a little more of a ball control offense. Devin Leary is their incumbent starter. I think he has NFL potential. He's not mobile, but he was the 4th best signal caller in terms of passing in the conference. 66% completion, 8 yards per attempt. He's more of a game manager, but he still had 35 scores and just 5 interceptions. He takes care of the ball, and he's not going to give it away to you. They lost a couple running backs. I don't think that matters. They're just going to plug and play guys there. They also recruited a 4-star who was a top 300 player. Their running back situation is going to be fine because they're returning 4 of their 5 starters on the offensive line, and they lose Ekwonu. That's huge. But every one of their starters played above average last year, and they have some pretty good star power, like Timothy McKay. He'll probably be asked to step up at right tackle. He's solid, and I think that's good. And they also have Chandler Zavala returning from injury. We'll see. He's fighting for eligibility, but you could be looking at 5 starters in the offensive line with experience. This is a solid unit overall, and as long as Clemson's still kind of where they were last year, this team has a good chance of beating them.
It's a team that you kind of already highlighted it. They return a lot at key positions. They know what they're doing. The schedule, I think, gels really nicely. You've got non-con East Carolina. If you get through that. Charleston Southern gets a gimme. Texas Tech's kind of interesting, but I think that NC State will still be a decisive favorite in that game, particularly at home, and then they get UConn. That's looking like 4. You got the showdown with Clemson. Then you get home to Florida State. That's certainly winnable. Then you get Syracuse, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, BC, Louisville, and UNC. There's not gimme games in there per se, but I mean, is it crazy to say that NC State is favored in 11 games?
If the season started today, they're favored in 11 games.
8.5 win total, favorite in 11 games. And the game that they'll be dogs to Clemson, I don't think is an auto loss.
I don't think so either. I think that's the game that decides their side of the conference, which is why I also kind of like NC State plus 500 to win the Atlantic. There's a discrepancy in terms of talent outside of these two teams. And we know Clemson's going to be favorite, but plus 500 to win the division is pretty solid odds there. I do think over 8.5 is still better, but I think you could play either.
I agree. The one thing about plus 500, you're definitely going to get a good price there. You could also, if you want, just take them money line in that game, because I don't see how there's really narrow scenarios where they lose to Clemson head to head and then they still represent their side. You'll probably get, I don't know, like plus 300 maybe in that game, money line, maybe a little less, but remains to be seen. I'm on board with all things NC State. I think them and Miami are probably the teams I'm highest on in the conference. Now we start to get the teams that I'm not as high on, and it starts to drop down. North Carolina, it takes a big jump. They're 15-1 to win this conference. Their win total is 7.5, but it's juiced to the under at minus 135. Sam Howell felt like he had been there forever. So where did they go now, and how do you look at this team for 2022?
This is one of the most volatile teams in the conference. They're recruiting extremely well. They're replacing a quarterback position, which is going to be key for this team. But overall, you look at the players they have on their roster, like they're going to be looking at a QB battle between 2 4-stars, really, and a couple of them are the higher recruits in their program's history, like Drake May, former 4-star, Jacoby Criswell, former 4-star. Both of them can run a little bit, it appears. We haven't really seen them. But May in particular was the number 9 quarterback in his class. These are really solid players, and they just need one of them to pan out. And you could see the roster look a lot better than people might think. Running back, they lose Ty Chandler. He's kind of just an average player. They do have a couple 4-star running backs coming in there. So Gregory Pettaway and Omarion Hampton come in, both 4-star runners. They have solid receiving production to throw to. So if Drake May or Jacoby Criswell can decisively win this job, throwing to Josh Downs and Antoine Green, those are solid players to look at here. And they have 4-star freshmen coming in, Andre Green, Tyshawn Chapman. These are solid players. And tight end Kamari Morales, he's there too. I think if they do take a step back somewhere, it could be on the offensive line. It's kind of hard to say here. They lose their top 3 players there, but they have some other players coming in, including 5-star Zach Rice. I mean, you got a 5-star coming in immediately in the offensive line, and they hit the portal a little bit hard here too. Corey Gaynor comes over from Miami. Spencer Rowland comes over for Harvard. So you have players that can potentially take that job up. On defense, 8 starters return, and this is a team that was banged up a lot last year on defense. So if you have healthy play out of some of these guys, I think you could see their defense also take a step forward. They finished 100th overall last year. They're certainly going to be better than that with the transfers they have coming in. And then particularly their secondary strong. They have a couple all-conference players there. Tony Grimes, if you look at safety, Cameron Kelly, those are honorable mention, third-team all-conference players now in another step forward this year. So I like this UNC team, but they're volatile, kind of like Clemson because of the quarterback situation. But it's not just that. They have questions on the offensive line, some at receiver. Fortunately, they have really good recruits coming in. So if any of them can play up to their recruiting level, I think this team could be an overachiever. But to me, it's just a lot to bet on. You need so much to coalesce that the win total's probably a stay away.
I have zero interest in the win total. If I had to bet it, I would bet the under just because I think there's more questions than answers at this point. I will say of the conference, I think we've talked about the serious threats. This is the one team. Well, there's one other team, and we'll get to them. But I think UNC is one of the teams that has the biggest range of outcomes. I think there are some scenarios where they're actually a serious threat to make some noise just because of how many unknowns You mentioned, when teams are really banged up the year before, as bad as that is, the one good thing is a lot of guys get a lot of reps that they probably normally wouldn't, and it gives them some added experience in the future years. We saw that with Oklahoma last year. Maybe it'll pay dividends this year. I just don't want to do that on a win total. I'd rather rev it up, and I would say maybe to win the Coastal at 4-1, but even that, you're behind Miami and Pittsburgh. I just don't see it. So I don't have much to say with UNC. Keep an eye on them. Probably a good team to pick your spots during the year and maybe bet in actual games if the quarterback situation looks stable.
Yeah, I mean, their schedule's tough too. So you played Notre Dame in non-con. Outside of that, like App State's not bad. They'll be favored against App State, but they're definitely a live dog. Georgia State, Florida A&M. So I think you have one game where they're decisive underdog. They're going to be an underdog to Miami. They're going to be an underdog to Pittsburgh and NC State, who they draw in the crossover. Wake Forest is going to be a pick 'em. They almost have identical odds to win the conference. That's 5 games where they're underdogs or in some sort of pick 'em contest. And if you think App State is even relatively close, not to mention some of the other teams that I didn't talk about in their ACC schedule, I think you could be looking at a team that does underachieve a little bit if something that we mentioned doesn't go according to plan with the younger players.
Wake Forest, another team that maybe fits this profile a little bit. 8.5 wins. It's juiced to the under at -135. Their win total is better than UNC, but their odds to win the ACC is even less. And I think that speaks to volatility of North Carolina versus Wake Forest. Wake Forest is 18-1 to win them. Obviously, their program has reached heights that maybe they never will see again in recent years. Is that run over? What remains for the Demon Deacons?
Sam Hartman's back, the third best passer in the ACC, according to PFF. Not mobile, but really solid numbers, and he has the receivers to fall back on. They lose Jacare Roberson, but A.T. Perry's there. He's first-team All-ACC caliber player. He almost had 1,300 receiving yards last year. The dude is awesome, and they get Donovan Green back. And people might not remember Donovan Green, but this guy was excellent in a somewhat shortened 2020 season before he missed all of last year with an injury, but he's an absolute burner, an early breakout for this team. And both of them have well above average yards per route run. So you have 2 solid receivers there. Then you have a likely split at wide receiver 3 between Taylor Moore and Keyshawn Williams. Williams was awesome in a small sample last year, only participated in 25% of the routes, and he mostly plays in the slot. But he caught 27 balls, for 404 yards. Just incredibly efficient play there. Tight end is a somewhat useful position for this team. It'll be more of a role player. But I think offensively, this team's going to continue to fire on all cylinders. Not to mention they only lost 1 lineman. It was a good lineman, like Zach Tom got drafted by the Packers. But the rest of their starters are going to be solid players here. The question to me is, can their defense hold up? They were actually okay last year, 48th overall. Some injuries hurt them, but we also saw their defense exploited in some games. So I'm a little worried about the high-end talent here with their defense. I think the secondary is probably going to be the strength of it. They have a lot of solid players returning there. Kalen Carson in particular is one I like that they got back at corner. But honestly, I think the returning production on defense should at least be in line kind of with their 48th ranking overall. Their 6 starters were good that they returned. So it's a roster that I do like. The questions for me just come schedule-wise. They don't play an easy schedule again. And it's not just like their non-con is cupcakes, but Liberty, Army, these are teams that Army in particular, they struggled with last year defending that triple option. And then their conference schedule, they do have some teams that are tough, like Clemson's on the schedule, North Carolina, NC State. Those are all tough opponents. So with their win total at 8.5, you just see enough games where they could potentially lose or where they'll be an underdog where I think they're hard to bet.
Definitely tough to bet. Not going to bet them. I think it will come down to if they can sweep Army and Liberty, that'll be 4-0 in non-con. That'll go a long way. It gives them a little room. They're going to have to probably beat the, Boston College, Florida State, Louisville types, UNC. All these teams are going to cannibalize each other. I think that Wake Forest is a pretty low variance team. It feels like their entire range of outcomes is like 7, 8, or 9. I don't have a lot to say there. I think they'll be fine. They're certainly going to put up points, but they're going to get exploited defensively again, I think, in too many games for me to do anything. I have zero interest. I would much rather bet North Carolina to win the ACC or to win their side than to bet Wake Forest. I just don't see that happening here. And that's really where I think the drop-off begins, because now we start to get to some teams like Louisville, who 28-1 to win the ACC, 6.5 win total. The over is, where is that over? Plus money potentially? I got to look at that. This is a team, we know they've got a super dynamic playmaker, but what else do the Cardinals even have at this point?
Their schedule is where I think this discussion needs to start. Okay. Their non-con is so difficult. UCF, that's going to be a pick-em game. UCF's a really strong team. We can say what we want about Gus Malzahn, but he's brought in a lot of talent. Whether he can actually utilize it on the field, that's always been a question for him. But he's been hammering the transfer portal and recruiting really well for a G5. That's not an easy game. They play USF, another team which has just slaughtered the transfer portal. That's not going to be an easy game. Kentucky, that's going to be a game where they're certainly an underdog. Their crossover, they get Pittsburgh and Virginia. Pittsburgh being the far more difficult opponent there. And then on their side of the conference, you have Clemson on the road and NC State. Not to mention they'll be a dog to Wake Forest. These are Florida State as well. They won't be a dog to Florida State, but it'll be close to a pick 'em. These are really hard games for Louisville and a really tough schedule, which is tough to see because I love this coaching staff and I love what they've done recruiting into the transfer portal. They've adapted very well to the NIL age. Satterfield's been awesome. He brings in Lance Taylor as his OC. He's a guy that coached running backs for Notre Dame from 2019 to 2021. They should have a dynamic rushing attack, but is it enough to overpower these teams? And last year we saw Malik Cunningham. He basically had to put the team on his back. They finished with a negative record. They went 6-7, I think, because of that. And if he were to get injured or anything like that, because of the way they play, their win total is just toast. So it's not one I want to back, even with the over at plus money. As far as player personnel, you mentioned Cunningham, love him. He has elite dual threat ability. They bring in Tyon Evans at running back from Tennessee to complement Jalen Mitchell, who is already really efficient himself. They also hit receiver pretty hard in the portal. Tyler Hudson comes over from Central Arkansas. He was highly productive in the FCS. D. Wiggins comes over from Miami. They also return their leading pass catchers, Marshawn Ford and Amari Huggins-Bruce. Offensive line, they return 5 players with significant starting experience. And their defense is probably going to be better. They're returning 7 starters there. Some of them have all-conference type play, and their defense was 90th overall. So, I mean, asking for improvement there's not asking for a lot. But to me, the whole question comes down to, how do they find wins on this schedule? It is brutal.
It really is. There is not one game that's a gimme in all 12. Their easiest game, I guess, would be James Madison. James Madison's not, that's not a made-up team where they'll be 40-point favorites. They'll be decisive favorites, and they should win that game. And it's in the middle of the schedule. It's not like they open with Syracuse. I guess that's a pretty reasonable game. But you drop one like that, it could be curtains pretty early for this team. You mentioned UCF closing with Kentucky. I don't really see it, to be honest. I think that I would go under, but again, similar to Wake Forest, similar to North Carolina, this is the one spot in the ACC I'm not doing anything with. I like to skip these teams in the middle. I like the teams at the top, and I like the teams kind of at the bottom, and we're about to get to that half of them, starting with Virginia. 7.5 wins. The under is juiced really heavily, though, to -160. So the books are saying that most likely this team isn't clearing 7.5. They're another team, though, big-time signal caller, 35-1 to win the conference. You mentioned some, not turmoil, but the program is undergoing some changes. Is that what kind of holds them back, or is it something else?
It pulls them back. They're losing a lot of talent, which we'll get to. They returned their signal caller, Brennan Armstrong. He's solid. I thought he might go to the NFL this year, but he decided to come back. 65% completion, 9 yards attempt, 31 scores, 10 interceptions. Solid dual threat ability, which has gotten him hurt at times, but you still like to see it. They had former 4-star Cody Brown from Miami as a transfer. The receivers are awesome. Dontavian Wicks is a future NFLer. 3.25 yards per route run is well above the league average. It's elite territory, like first-round draft, capital level territory. Keaton Thompson, former quarterback, he's kind of like this gadgety player for them. He's solid as well. 2.54 yards per route run. Billy Kemp is going to play in and out of the slot. Another solid returner. He had 725 yards last year. And they get back Lavelle Davis, who missed all of last year with an ACL. He was a freshman breakout, second leading receiver on the team as a freshman. That's all solid. So you have the pass catchers, you have the quarterback, you have a decent runner. They lost their top 6 offensive linemen. That's going to be huge for them. And I just don't know if they have the offensive minds to potentially maximize this. They're replacing their entire coaching staff. They bring in Tony Elliott from Clemson, who has had success, certainly, but they also bring in Des Kitchens as their OC. He was the Falcons running back coach last year. He coached running backs at South Carolina before that. I'm a little worried this team tries to run the ball behind a completely revamped offensive line without running back talent and fails to maximize the talent they actually have. Then you look at their defense, they're going to be replacing a lot, just 6 starters, and their defense is 115th. So their defense needs to take a ton of jumps, and I don't know that they necessarily can. I just don't see where this team really goes right now. It's a multi-year rebuild, which I think is going to be tough for them considering, Brennan Armstrong's on expiring essentially time of play. Dontavian Wicks is going to go to the NFL at some point. I don't know when Virginia maximizes this.
I do like their schedule a little bit. It's pretty soft to get things started. You got Richmond, Illinois, Old Dominion, Syracuse, and Duke to start. I mean, you could rack up 4 or 5 right there. I'm not sure how many wins they can find in the back half when you're getting Miami and UNC and Pittsburgh. But still, I think they have a decent shot despite all the problems. I actually think they have a decent shot to get to 8 wins, and it's just a product of their schedule. There's just a lot of winnable games. They avoid Clemson on the schedule, and they really don't play. I mean, their toughest game is at home to Miami. I mean, that's not super brutal. It's going to be a loss most likely, but I think it's a manageable schedule.
Yeah, it's not bad. If the season were to start today, you're going to be underdogs to Pitt, North Carolina, Miami, and Louisville. We'll see how the Illinois game shakes out, but you're underdogs in 4 games to start the year. That puts them right around their win total, which is why it's a no bet for me because of the volatility of the team. If I were to take a side, it definitely would be the over. You're getting it at plus money, which is the big decider here. Unders minus 160, which I think that's the side that's more likely to occur, but I don't know if the odds are, solid enough here. It's kind of another schedule where you have a lot of high-end opponents and a lot of low-end opponents, like Miami, North Carolina, Pitt, but then you also have Georgia Tech, Duke, winnable games, certainly.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I would take the plus money if you want to take a position. I'd rather just roll more onto NC State or one of the teams we talked about at the beginning or the teams we're about to get to, including I want to talk about Florida State. I've been waiting for this one. This is one of the teams I'm very excited to talk about. 6.5 win total, over at minus 135, the under at plus 115. They are 35-1 to win the conference. They used to be the perennial, to win the ACC, it goes through Tallahassee. That is not the case anymore. They've got LSU and non-con. Any return to what Florida State had been for a couple decades, or is it still in the rebuild?
They're still in the rebuild. Another tough schedule. I mean, in your non-con, you schedule LSU and Florida. Florida, I mean, it's a rivalry game. You're going to get that. But having LSU in the non-con, you're dogs in both those games. In the conference, you get Miami, you get Clemson, you get NC State. 5 games, you're clear dogs in. From there, you're also probably a dog against Wake Forest. You're close to Pick'em against Louisville, probably a slight dog. That's 7 games right there where they're dogs to Pick'ems. And this win total, I mean, it's sitting at a reasonable 6.5, but I mean, if you're a dog in 7 games, it means you're looking at 5 wins. If we were projecting this out as your most likely scenario, that's a lot of value towards the under, and the under is plus 115. That's all before we even get into the roster. And I like their roster. It's just tough for this coaching staff overall. I hope they're not on the hot seat because I think you could have a team that has significant improvement this year, but still just has an absolute murderer's row of opponents. Jordan Travis is better than people think. 6th highest graded passer in the ACC last year, and that's without even taking into consideration what he did on the ground. 530 rushing yards, 7 scores on just 134 attempts. That's really good rushing ability, and he did take a step forward as a passer. They have solid production coming in at receiver via the portal. Johnny Wilson comes over from that dysfunctional Arizona State team. Micah Pittman comes over from Oregon. You still have Ontario Wilson, Malik McClain, some solid players like Winston Wright and Deuce Spann coming in via the portal. Cameron McDonald at tight end. Their offensive line returns just one starter, but they have a lot of like situational players that are coming back with starting experience. So every time we talk about starters returning, there's a little nuance to it. If you start like 3 games, it doesn't count as a full starter. But they have a lot of players that saw time. I think that's going to help them a lot. And then 8 starters on defense. And their defense was the strength of their team last year. They finished 21st overall. So I think they're probably going to try to rely on that defense and then create a dynamic rushing attack that features Travis. It's just, to me, is that enough to overcome Florida, LSU, Miami, Clemson? Probably not this year. So I hope their coaching staff has a little bit of a leash. I think this could be a team that we look to in future seasons because they have improved on recruiting. This year, they're 20th, and in the transfer portal, they're 13th. They're a little ways away, but they're definitely getting there.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be on Florida State throughout the year. I can just already see this. They're a team that it's easy to play the what if game, but they could have and possibly should have beaten Notre Dame to open their season. They lost in a heartbreaking overtime, and then the season derailed. They lost to Jacksonville State, and everything kind of crumbled. They played well in the second half of the season. I give their coaching staff credit. They got them back up. They played close games against pretty good teams. They did beat Miami last year. Lost to Florida by 3. Somebody beat UMass by 56. That's always a noted special. I agree that it's tough to take a position when you look at this schedule because it's very daunting, and they could improve a lot and still only get to 5 or 6 wins. But I do think this is a team that's going to win some of the games where they are underdog this year. It's just a matter of how many. I like them in situational spots, but I think they're a better team to bet than take a preseason position on. We got to see what they look like. I think they surprised some people this year, though.
I 100% agree. I don't think they're going to make a bowl, which is why the under would be the play for me. But again, you mentioned it. They're going to play a lot of good teams this year. There might be some lopsided spreads early in the season. I'd rather back them as live dogs.
Yeah, they're going to be in some games. Now we get to the bottom feeders of the ACC, and there's a handful of them. Boston College, I wouldn't say is at the doormat, but because it's 6.5 wins, minus 135 to the under. But I do think that this is a team that could have some dysfunction. What do you see from them? Do you lean over or under? I doubt that you think they're a serious threat in this conference.
They're just replacing too much. Tough schedule. Non-con featuring Rutgers. That's not going to be an easy game for them. I bet Rutgers in week 1. They have Maine. We can exclude them. But they also have Notre Dame really late in the year, and they're traveling to Notre Dame. So you have two difficult opponents there. Their crossover is kind of lopsided. Virginia Tech, I mean, that's going to be rivalry game always. And then you draw Clemson, of course, NC State. Those are tough teams. But the roster is churning a lot. Phil Jurkovec, he returns. He was injured most of last year, but I still think they're looking for more from him. He's been solid in situational spots, but he's still a guy that struggles with turnover at times, just a 61% completion, 7.6 yards per attempt. That's like, if you look at PFF grades, that's 9th in the ACC, so not great, but not bad. Pat Garwo is limited as a running back. He can't catch any passes. I think Sinkfield from West Virginia originally is probably going to be asked to do that. They do have Zay Flowers coming back, Jaden Williams, Jalen Gill. Those are solid players at receiver, but their offensive lines are replacing every single starter. And that was the strength of their team last year. They could run behind that offensive line. I have no idea what this is going to look like with basically a completely revamped unit. I think if you look at the strengths of Boston College, it is still probably their defense. 8 starters return there. That defense finished 31st overall, but you do lose a decent amount of talent there. Of their starters, just one of them earned all conference honors. So this could be a unit that takes a slight step back too. To me, it's just, I don't know how they play with some of the very key losses they had. I think this is going to be volatile overall. And then, on their coaching staff, Boston College is looking at a new OC. John McNulty comes in. He was the Notre Dame tight ends coach. And you can see based on some additions they made in the transfer portal and his familiarity with Jurkovec that this could be a fit. But, I'm not sure how McNulty looks. Like, he was a QB coach in the NFL for a lot of his career, but then tight ends at Notre Dame. It's a pretty big step up for him. The offense could look different, and I'm not sure how they play.
So I'll give them, obviously, you got Maine, UConn, and Duke. That's 3. You got to find 4 more. I don't really see it. I name the teams that I think would do it would be winning against Syracuse, Virginia Tech, Rutgers, maybe like Louisville, but that's going to be pretty tough. The rest of their games are getting progressively harder. I don't think that this team can get there. I'll be honest. I like the under here. I think they land to 5 or 6.
I agree with you. You have a lot of wiggle room here. It is one of the bets I actually like a little bit here, especially because like a Rutgers team, they're ascending. Like that's not going to be an easy game whatsoever. Rutgers is a 7-point underdog, so you're looking at a considerable upset if it does occur, but not an easy game for them. Virginia Tech, they're probably going to be close to a pick 'em in that game. Florida State, their dog. Louisville, dog. Clemson, dog. Wake Forest, dog. UConn, Duke, you mentioned will be wins. But then to close out their season, NC State, Notre Dame, they're resounding underdogs before they get Syracuse to win. I think most likely scenario, you're looking at 5 to 6 wins, which gives you a lot of wiggle room towards the under on this win total. It's definitely one I'm looking at.
Virginia Tech. If I don't really have a school, but if I did, it would be Virginia Tech. I always like them. 6.5, under to -145. I don't know, man. Blacksburg, it doesn't seem good right now. They got a lot of issues. I was looking at this roster while I was prepping for the show. I got more questions than answers. The books seem to think that they're going to be fighting for a bowl game. I mean, non-con is interesting. Old Dominion, Wofford, West Virginia's in there, and Liberty. I don't know. Talk to me about this team, because to me, it seems like it could be pretty bad.
New coaching staff. I actually like Brent Pry. He was a solid DC with Penn State. Tyler Bowen's their OC. He was the Jaguars tight end coach last year. He also coordinated the offense for Penn State. He co-coordinated it in 2020. I think that's why he gets the job here. Chris Marv is a former linebacker coach for Florida State. He's their DC. So you have a completely unknown coaching staff. You're still dealing with the fallout from completely bungling the Hendon Hooker situation. So they bring in Grant Wells from Marshall, who's solid, but Grant Wells, even in Conference USA, he was still only the 5th highest graded signal caller there per PFF. 66.5% completion percentage, 8 yards per attempt, not mobile. He's going to have to deal with the rigors of the ACC now. This isn't Conference USA. They don't have a good running back. Malachi Thomas is there. He was okay. He was a true freshman, so I think you could pencil in some improvement there. But they also lose Tavian Robinson, Trey Turner, Raheem Blackshear. Their top 4 receivers are gone. Jaden Blue comes over from Temple. He had a solid year in 2019 where he had 95 catches, over 1,000 yards, but he's essentially just a little slot receiver, and he took massive steps back since then. Last year, he caught just 30 passes for 185 yards. So Jaden Blue is a guy you need to take that step back to where he was. Otherwise, this pass game is going to be a complete disaster because they don't have anyone behind him. Their offensive line loses 3 starters. That's going to be a big problem from them. Their defense is probably the strength. They returned 7 starters there, but the defense was 100th in the country last year. You have 3 all-conference players, most of them coming in the secondary, but up front, this is going to be an issue for them. Their defensive line, they have solid pieces, but I don't think they have the complete body of work to actually do anything and make any noise here. The roster's bad overall. They're definitely in a long-time rebuild. And their schedule, it's not great, but, like West Virginia and non-con, they're probably a dog there. Old Dominion is, honestly a live dog. I don't think Old Dominion wins by any means, but the schedule is not easy either. I'm looking at the under for this team at 6.5. I honestly can't believe it's this high.
Yeah, they also only play 6 home games. Like some of these teams, they get like 9 home games. Virginia Tech, they're going to be hitting the road a lot more, and they have a real good home field advantage. They're
only 7-point favorites over Old Dominion, for your reference.
Well, that's all you really need to know. I think Old Dominion might be okay, to be honest, but that says a lot about Virginia Tech as well. And when they hit the road, North Carolina, Pittsburgh, NC State, Liberty. Like, Liberty's not a bad team. I know Malik Willis isn't there, but they'll be Duke. Rivalry game with Virginia. I think there's a chance that Virginia Tech is the 2nd worst team in the entire conference. I mean, Duke's in a separate category, but I think it could be really bad this year.
It definitely could be. You're essentially looking at a completely revamped offensive line, no runner of consequence, a G5 starter transferring in at quarterback. I do think their defense is solid, and if they can win games, it's probably low-scoring, slow, volatile affairs. but that's not something I want to put my money on overall. So to me, the under is the best play. It's under 6.5. You're looking at a schedule where they're going to be favored, I think, just against Duke, Georgia Tech, Wofford, and then Old Dominion. I think they're favored in 4 games. Maybe Liberty if you give them that 5.
Yeah, and a couple of those are going to be inside a touchdown. Like,
a couple of them are going to be outside a touchdown too. If Old Dominion, they're only 7-point favorites there. Like, what's the spread against Boston College week 2?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be good. I don't even like Boston College that much, but I still would tilt the scales to Boston College in that game.
Me too. I think Boston College probably a 3 or 4 point favorite at least.
Yeah, and that's if Virginia Tech win. Like, if they lose to Old Dominion, forget it. Well, we'll see. Georgia Tech, I shouldn't even put Duke in their own category because Georgia Tech might rival them. 3.5 wins. Unders juiced a little bit at -120. This team, I mean, I know how long does it take to go from the triple option to normal offense? Because it seems like that derailed the program permanently. There's not a lot going on here. I mean, simply put, can they find 4 wins? Because it looks pretty bad. And then I'm looking at their non-con. That doesn't seem much better.
No, maybe the toughest schedule in the country outside of like Arkansas. They have Western Carolina. That's a gimme, but Clemson, Ole Miss, UCF to start the year. And then their final non-con is their last game, Georgia, the rivalry game. You're looking at 3 definitive losses to Ole Miss, UCF, and Georgia in their non-con. That is brutal. Inside the conference, you obviously get Clemson. We just mentioned that. But at Pittsburgh, at Florida State, at North Carolina, Miami at home. Man, I don't think there's more than 3 wins here, tops. Western Carolina, Duke, and then you gotta find a third one, and I don't know where the third one comes. Honestly, we can talk about the roster because this is another team where I think you could see roster improvement, but their schedule is so hard that the coaching staff could get fired either way. And their coaching staff's done a solid job. Like, they're 53rd in recruiting. That's decent for Georgia Tech. You'd like it to be a little higher, but 20th in the transfer portal. They actually added quite a few players here. It's just the schedule is so hard. I'm not sure what they can really do. If you want to talk the roster overall, Jeff Sims is still there, but they add former Clemson, I guess, rotational player at quarterback Tyson Fomashawn. Zach Gibson comes over from Akron. He could start. Running back, they bring in Hassan Hall from Louisville, Dylan McDuffie from Buffalo. They're going to try to run. Receiver is a position of weakness for them. They lost 3 starters in the offensive line. They do bring in some players to try to combat that. Pierce Quick's the former 4-star recruit, Alabama player. He comes over. Same thing with Paul Chio from Clemson, former 4-stars. I mean, they're trying. They're getting players coming in. Corey Robinson comes over from Kansas. RJ Adams from Kentucky. Their defense is going to be the biggest question here. Just 3 starters returning for a defense that finished 117th. Now, they add 6 transfers, and they actually got a 4-star in the secondary. But the defense is going to be bad. And your defense playing poorly against some of these teams we already mentioned in the schedule, it's a recipe for disaster for Georgia Tech. I kind of feel bad for the coaching staff. Like, I think they're going to get fired this year. And I mean, they've had multiple years to rebuild this program, so it's no excuse at this point in time. But Jeff Collins is getting a pretty rough draw for the schedule this year.
It's not even that it's like, oh, I can only find a couple games they're going to be favorite. When they're going to be underdog, unlike some of these other teams, they're going to be like 20-point underdog in a lot of these games. It's not like, oh, they're 4-point underdog. They're like, these are going to be double digit for them to win and clear this win total. They're going to have to beat someone that they really quote unquote shouldn't. And I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of scenarios they don't even get to 3.
They're 21-point underdogs to Clemson.
Honestly, that doesn't seem like enough.
It's juiced. Clemson's juiced, but you're right.
It's just, I mean, I know you get a gimme with Western Carolina, and honestly, Duke at home is as soft as it gets. The drop off to get the 3rd win is like having to go on the road to Blacksburg or beat Virginia at home. That's going to be a tall order for this team. I really don't see it. I think that they go 2-10.
And they need more than a 3rd win. They need to get 4. If you're
that's what I'm saying. Just to get to 3.
Yeah, there's a wiggle room here too. It's a solid bet.
Yeah. I mean, what kind of Ole Miss, Georgia, and UCF and non-con? Yikes. That is just awful. So tough situation for the Yellow Jackets. Two more teams. Syracuse. Their win total is 5, but they're down in the depths. I mean, they're not going to win the conference, so it doesn't really matter. Under is to minus 140. This is a team, again, at times they've been a tough out for a lot of opponents. Can they fight for a bowl, or are they fighting with Georgia Tech and Duke for the basement?
Probably fighting for the basement. Their biggest redeeming quality, I think, is they have a slightly easier schedule. Their non-con is still pretty tough, but you do have Wagner there. You know, I mean, like UConn's probably a win, but Purdue and Notre Dame are certainly losses in non-con. It's going to be a tough road for Syracuse. They're definitely trying to rebuild. They do have some interesting players on their team. Like Garrett Schrader's still there, but they got Carlos Del Rio Wilson. He's a former 4-star in the 2021 class. He comes over from Florida. Sean Tucker's back. He's the engine of their offense. Receiver's not terrible. Courtney Jackson's there. He's their best pass catcher. The offensive line lost just one starter, and he was well below average. The line needs a lot of development, but like Matthew Bergeron was solid. He's their left tackle, good PFF grade there. Chris Bleich is okay too. I think their offensive line will be better, and they want to run the ball. We certainly know that with the way they play and their like dual threat ability at quarterback. Then they returned 8 starters on defense. That was 48th overall in the country last year. A couple all-conference players too, like Michael Jones was first team all ACC. He's a linebacker. Darius Chestnut was third team. Garrett Williams, he was honorable mention all ACC. They have some pretty decent players on this defense. It's another situation where I think Syracuse is better than what people are giving them credit for. But how in the world is their win total 5? Where do 5 wins come for this team?
Yeah, I mean, obviously UConn and Wagner, but I don't know. This screams like elements of kind of what I just talked about with Georgia Tech. It's not like, oh, they have to pull an upset. They've got to pull multiple big time upsets to get here.
And I like the under for the win total too because of the push equity. It's 5. It's not 5.5. A lot of times you're going to, well, not even a lot of times. I think it's less likely than the middling situations here that they get to 5. I think they're probably at 4 most of the time, but
I just don't understand. Like, okay, where is their third most likely win on the schedule? Like, what game is that? Home to Virginia?
So you're giving them UConn and Wagner, I'm guessing, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, it's Virginia.
Like, that's not – Syracuse might be favored in that game. They're not going to be like 20-point favorites. They'll be like 6-point favorites.
If it's even that, they might be underdogs.
That's what I'm saying. What? That's the third win. Now you got to get the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th.
This is an easy under.
What are we talking about here? I just don't understand. I'm just unless you think that they can hold serve against teams like Louisville, Purdue, Florida State. That's a lot. I don't see it at all. This might be the most confusing one. I'm not saying it's even my favorite, but I really don't understand how they're coming up with this line.
We ranked our win totals to give you a preview. This was my favorite one, under 5 for Syracuse. So it's only minus 142. This should be like minus 200.
It should be 4.5 at minus 200. Honestly,
yes,
I really believe that. Last team, I'll tell you this much: if you got $100 and you bet Duke to win the ACC and they win, you get $100,000 back. The slight issue, much like Vanderbilt, I don't know if they'll even get 1 win in conference. They only need to get 3 wins for you to push. Their win total is 3 on the dot, slightly juiced to the under. This team is awful. Is there anything that we can talk about in terms of improvement, or is Duke just destined for another really bad year?
They're destined for a bad year. I don't know where their wins come from. So immediately they're underdogs in every single ACC game. Considerable underdogs at that. If you look at their chances to win the ACC, they're 100-1. The next team on this list is Syracuse. They're 25-1. So they're at least Vegas is telling us they're considerably worse than the second worst team, Syracuse. And then their non-con is Temple. Well, they're 7.5-point favorites in that game. Northwestern, I think they're probably a dog. North Carolina, A&T, and FCS team, they're going to be favored. In Kansas, they're probably a dog. Can they get to 3 wins out of that non-con? Probably not. It's a no bet for me, but let's talk about the roster, I guess. Like quarterback, complete controversy. Riley Leonard, Jordan Moore, Luka Diamant, all mobile. I like that every one of them's mobile, but I have no idea who's playing. They lost their best rusher in Mateo Durant. Jordan Waters and Jacques Moore are back. Neither are particularly good. Waters was actually okay. Wide receiver Jalen Calhoun, solid, but they lost Jake Bobo. He transferred out. Who replaces him? Offensive line wasn't great. They lose 2 starters. This could be the strength of their team. What they have coming back is actually decent. I think that's why we saw Mateo Durant be actually pretty good last year. And they did add some transfers, like Chance Little comes over from Colorado, Andre Harris from Arkansas State, and Jack Burns from Cornell. So if you're looking at a strength of the team, it's probably their run game. But their defense has just 5 starters returning for a group that was 118th overall in the country, just 1 player with all conference honors. You look at the portal for this team on defense, they added 4 players. Only one of them is projected to start in Jordan Morant. Tough ask for this team to win. I think even 2 games. 3 is probably not happening for this team.
It's bad. I will say, though, I really don't have a lot of interest in putting down money on here, even to short. It would be to short them, but the non-con is against some junky teams as well. I just have no interest here. I think you just leave Duke alone. They're going to be the bottom feeder. They're going to get beat up on by the rest of the conference. I think they probably win a couple games in non-con, and maybe they pull one upset in the conference, and we call it a day.
Yeah, I agree with you.
For me, there's other teams. So, of course, we have just ran through the entire ACC, and with the season rapidly approaching, you're going to get this each and every week. That is why you want to subscribe to this channel. You want to take advantage of BetMGM, that risk-free bet of up to $1,000. No reason not to do that. Anytime the books are giving you opportunities for those type of bets, you want to take advantage. But let's do a quick recap before we get out of here. You mentioned that Syracuse ultimately is towards the top of your favorite bets. What other team do you think stands out that you really want to put your money down on?
Yeah, Syracuse under 5 is by far the win total I like the most. We just discussed that, but under 140 is a crime. I think you should take that one for sure. I like Boston College under 6.5. That's at minus 135. Just a team with a lot to rebuild, especially in the offensive line. And they have a tough schedule. I think this most likely lands on 5 most of the time. So 6.5 towards the under is pretty solid. And then NC State, there's a very real chance they're favored in 11 games this year. Their win total is 8.5. It is minus 150. If you don't want to lay that juice, I think you could bet them plus 500 to win the ACC. But that game likely comes down to them versus Clemson. And you mentioned a very good strategy, which is just taking them on the money line in that game, which is probably around plus 300-ish, depending on how these teams fare up to that point. Those are my favorite 3.
I'm with you on all 3. I'm just going to throw one more, as much as it pains me. I think that Virginia Tech really could struggle this year. You've got that at 6.5. It is just a little to the under, but that's another under that I would short. And then, I'm sorry. Let me add in Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech might be at the top. I don't see them in Syracuse. I think it's going to be really ugly at the bottom of the ACC. So I'm with you on NC State, certainly with you on Syracuse. I'll let in Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech as kind of 2 teams that I think do struggle quite a bit. The season is getting started soon enough, friends, and we cannot wait to start getting into individual spreads. We'll be breaking down all the games, VODs, long form, everything that you want. But for me, for Matt, for everyone here at Odd Shopper, thanks again for tuning in, watching the ACC preview. And of course, next week, stay tuned. Even more conference breakdowns, getting you ready for what's going to be a great college football season. We'll talk to you guys then.